There's a brand new highway in India and a new rail station in Bangladesh. A seaport recently opened in Sri Lanka, as well as a new bridge in Turkey. What's interesting is that they are all part of one country's project that spans 3 continents and touches over 60% of the world's population. When you connect the dots, it's not hard to see what country that is. This is China's Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure plan in modern history designed to reroute global trade. And according to Vox Atlas, it's how China plans to become the world's next superpower. We've got some incredible briefers today, to include myself, David G., Mike, I'll do anything for Salinas, Julius Action Jackson, and my main man, Derek, the big time Anderson. This presentation will introduce our theme and topic, describe core mission support, detail joint, interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational operations, present our execution plan to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, and finally we'll end with the conclusion and our references used. According to Vox Atlas, the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, was introduced in 2013 by Chinese President Xi Jinping. It is a multi-trillion-dollar program incorporating both land and sea routes connecting China with more than 100 countries throughout Asia and Europe. With all roads leading to and from China, the BRI has solidified their position and influence in trade, logistics, energy, and banking. The BRI includes an economic belt which connects key cities throughout Asia and Europe via road and rail, and a maritime Silk Road which consists of sea routes within the Indo-Pacific region, Africa, and the Middle East. The BRI has enabled China to invest heavily in foreign markets. One example that Vox Atlas gives is their $1 billion investment to build a new highway and port in Gwadar, Pakistan. This port created a new hub connecting the economic belt to the maritime Silk Road, and 17 years later, their $1 billion investment had ballooned into a $62 billion corridor for importing oil from the Middle East. According to data from the World Bank, by 2019, 7 of the 10 largest global construction firms were Chinese, and China boasted the world's second highest GDP. This has all sounded great for China, but from the United States' standpoint, it has raised some challenges and concerns. The following 3 concerns are all pulled from Vox Atlas. First, China has employed predatory economics. What I mean by that is they provide loans to many unstable governments and factions, anticipating that the loans will default. Many times, China does not care about the money, because if a loan defaults, they know that they can simply take over whatever infrastructure they funded. Moreover, a key component of the BRI contract is that Chinese firms must be the ones doing the work, so they receive partial payment regardless. An example is Sri Lanka, who was unable to repay a loan for a new seaport. Instead of money, they gave China control of the port through a 99-year lease. The second challenge revolves around the strategic locations that China builds and owns infrastructure. They now control ports in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Pakistan, and Djibouti, where they actually have a naval unit stationed. These locations make up the string of pearls, and it's concerning because it enables China to virtually control all the key sea routes within the Indian Ocean. Finally, China's BRI is highlighting the fact that the United States is doing the exact opposite. We are more focused on domestic opportunities and investing less in the foreign market. This has weakened our position and influence in the world. There are plenty of existing policy and doctrine that relate to the BRI, and I will now focus on 3 of them. The National Security Strategy highlights the need to promote free, fair, and reciprocal economical relationships. The U.S. can achieve this by countering unfair trade practices and foreign corruption. Secondly, the The National Defense Strategy highlights the need to strengthen alliances and attract new partners. The U.S. can achieve this by working closely with allies and partners for sustained strength and success. Finally, the National Military Strategy highlights the need for appropriate force management, where we respond to threats and deter strategic attacks. All of three of these excerpts relate to China and what the United States must do to counter the BRI. I will now describe three objectives that are supported from the policy and doctrine that I just described that the U.S. can use to counter China and their BRI. Objective 1. Expand our presence in Southeast Asia. We will achieve this by utilizing and implementing joint and multinational exercises, as well as increasing foreign aid and government sales. Objective 2. Relieve economic stress of unstable governments. To do this, we will partner with the International Development Finance Corporation to pay off existing debt to China and restructure new loans. Objective 3. Build up space power. Space is an emerging domain and can be used to increase ISR, and we can achieve this by partnering with multiple NGOs such as SpaceX. At this point, I've introduced China and explained the challenges revolving around the Belt and Road Initiative. We've examined existing doctrine and formulated three objectives that we can use to counter the BRI. I will now pass it off to Mike, who will discuss core mission support.
How are you doing today? I'm Master Sergeant Salinas, and I'll be discussing how we can leverage Cyber ISR to the growing Belt and Road Initiative. So, Cyber ISR can be implemented into the Belt and Road Initiative to allow the U.S. and allies, if and how it is being used to gain military advantage. Because as we've discussed, it has been sold as a win-win project for the world to develop new trade routes, to distribution backbone infrastructure, to develop countries that are less developed at the time. However, there are some concerns that this Belt and Road Initiative can be used for other aspects. In the terrestrial and maritime domains, the Belt and Road Initiative now includes multiple deep seaports in strategic proximity to vital sea lanes and maritime choke points. The fact that a number of BRI port projects in the Indo-Pacific do not appear commercially viable raises questions about Beijing's motives for investing in these infrastructures. So what they're basically saying is that the Chinese have been building these ports in areas where they could militarize them, use them in choke points where prior you couldn't pass. Our Navy could stop them. Now they're controlling these ports, and now they have free reign access. So this is a concern for the United States and our allies, obviously. But one of the things we can do is we can use real-time cyber ISR. We can use it can allow the U.S. and its allies. We can take a closer look into the development of the use of non-commercial viable locations and determine their uses, strengths, or vulnerabilities. By using cyber ISR, this gives us a less intrusive approach to this. But we can't just think of it as cyber ISR. We have to look at the big picture and use multi-domain operations. So we can get a picture of how the lease properties can impact China's reach and what's happening in the cyber realm. So right off the top, we can use overhead satellites. Our satellites are less intrusive than using an aircraft to fly over the U-2s, whatever we want to use to scan and see what's taking place down on the ground. With satellites, we can kind of, from orbit, see the movements, track what type of packages are coming in, coming out. Do they fit the mold of actually building up a port that's going to be used for commercial use? Or do they have some parts and pieces that can be militarized to make it a base? Now that's one part of it. So we can see that from the surface. But the other part behind the screens is what we need to look at as well. So there's going to have to be a layered approach with cyber, as the Diplomat article highlights. The digital Silk Road along BRI infrastructure development can increase China's surveillance technologies. So again, the space allies can see the outside, but the detection capabilities, that's what we're looking at here, because they can start doing surveillance and subversion. So we need to look at the cyber aspects, capabilities to determine their surveillance initiative and deter it from building a cloud of uncertainty. So they can use this to kind of operate still under the false pretense that this is just going to be used for trade. This is going to be used to strengthen countries, but behind the cyber doors, they're actually planning how to militarize this, how to use surveillance to their benefits. Again, we have allies in some of these countries, so we need to make sure we're watching their backs as well. I'm not at liberty to discuss exactly how the Air Force would accomplish this task, but there are organizational set pieces, which, while accomplishing the operational preparation of the environment, which that's basically us seeing what we can do, how it operates, intel gathered can be used to harden our networks, prevent data spillage. We don't want our data getting out because, of course, we operate in all the different countries. So while our information is with maybe one of our Five Eye brothers and sisters, we don't want our data getting out. And while they're setting up this surveillance, it could hinder our ability to operate. Another thing we'll look at is information can be utilized for planning purposes, expanding the U.S. and allies' global reach. So we've already talked about that, how our allies are in some of these countries, they touch place because the Belt and Road Initiative does touch on Europe, Asia, and Africa, where we have bases or operations within those countries. So of course it holds a great deal of interest to us. By using cyber ISR, which entails cyber and space assets, the U.S. can ensure military strategies prepared to respond to threats, strategic attacks they can put in place with the win-win initiative opening trade that China has sold to so many countries. Without using cyber ISR as a core capability, and its allies would have to operate on a partial operational plan. So again, we can see what's on the surface, but we couldn't see what's happening behind the scenes, the planning. So by using cyber ISR, we may go in there with half a plan, where we could cause collateral damage, lose credibility, and have negative impacts for us and our allies. But we can't just jump straight in and do cyber ISR. We can't just jump straight in and go into a counterattack when China hasn't done anything yet. On top of that, we can't just go in just hoping that if they do take action, we plan for that day. We need to be prepared and planned ahead of time. So that's what I'm talking about next. Next slide. So now that we know how cyber can be leveraged as far as operating, we can use this to counteract and be prepared for the Belt and Road Initiative taking a different turn. We need to look at how cyber ISR mission support will be integrated into exercise plans that can be shaped to the initiative. So these exercise plans, we do exercises all the time in the military. We've done 1,000 of them. But with the Belt and Road Initiative on the surface being labeled as an enhancement of regional connectivity between Asia, Europe, and Africa, we have seen some of the alternative uses. Now we'll discuss how cyber ISR can be used to view infrastructure built up from a structural and cyber network perspective. The U.S. and its allies need to be prepared to operate in this environment. So this environment is much different than a conventional environment. This isn't one where we can just send in a bomber to blow up the seaports, because these impact people's daily lives. Some of these countries are our allies, some of them are neutral and partial towards us, some of them we trade with. We use the same trade routes, so doing something that drastic as far as if an event took place where we send in a bomber just to blow up the port, it would have, of course, mass collateral damage. On top of that, it could impact our global appearance. So what we need to do is be prepared to be able to have a multi-layered approach. We need to be able to exercise with our allies, exercise a targeted area specific to see how we can operate should something arise within the Belt and Road Initiative's pathway. One of the things I looked at, was utilizing the persistent cyber training environment in conjunction with multi-domain exercises for the region. So to read a quote here, it says, delivered on the Cyber Mission Force since February 22, PCTE provides a platform for ongoing assessment and development of cyber tactics, techniques, and policy procedures for real-world defensive missions across boundaries and networks. Previously, cyber forces developed cyber terrain ranges for specific scenarios that would be used once, a process that would take months. Utilizing this already developed platform, the cyber ISR scenario can be layered with multi-domain operations to utilize full spectrum operations for the U.S. and our Five Eyes, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom. All right. So looking at that, what they're basically saying is what the U.S. what we should do, should something take place, is leverage this new persistent cyber training environment. So basically, when they do cyber training environments, they're looking into a range to simulate effects. So that's what we need to do in this scenario, along with our allies, with the Five Eyes, because of course what we talked about prior, the Belt and Road Initiative is going to be touching Europe. It is going to be touching Africa, and our other allies, Canada, they're going to be looking at the Belt and Road Initiative with concern as well. So what we need to do is develop exercise to make sure it's layered, instead of just thinking we have to have boots on ground or using drones. We can use the cyber ISR to set us up. We have our satellites. We can prepare an exercise to where you layer these effects with conventional effects to see how we would operate. One of the big things we'll look at is SCADA. SCADA, not sure how I'm saying it right. But as a supervisory control and data acquisition system that a lot of plants use. It can be used to for operations. This can be used for oil, the shipping for the seaports, the network infrastructure, the backbone they're also trying to build. These are like central nodes where they can distribute data and do the flow of processes. If we were able to find out this type of information through cyber ISR, it would give the U.S. and its allies a distinct advantage understanding what their plans are, what their process is, and how they're going to use it. So that's one of the things that the U.S. and its allies should try to look towards doing. While we're talking about the exercise as well, the PCTE exercise already has a joint effort with 500 personnel, 17 cyber teams, allied nations. We already talked about the Five Eyes. So, laying the exercise with the intent to seek ways to disrupt, deny, and degrade SCADA networks, the U.S. military would join operationally with this many personnel. Their partners have just as much interest because the Belt and Road impacts the trade routes to their countries and military uses as well. The cyber ISR elements being a part of exercise scenario will allow us to determine the capabilities that we need to implement and lead up to and during a conflict with the militarization of the Belt and Road Initiative. This directly coincides with the national defense strategy, strengthening our alliances, working with allies for long term. Before I turn it over to Jack to discuss joint interagency, intergovernmental, multinational impact, and the Belt and Road Initiative, I'd like to reference my references. During the global pandemic, U.S. Cybercom trains virtually to defend networks, protect nation, 2020, and China is weaponizing the Belt and Road. What can the U.S. do about it? 2020 October. That concludes my brief. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that, Mike. Diplomacy will be the center of our foreign policy plan and will be the baseline necessity for our national security. In 1991 and 92, we removed the vast majority, pretty much all troops in the Philippines. And since this time, we've seen China increasingly take over more and more territory within this region. Christian 2020. Which is why our first objective is to expand our presence in the Southeast Asia region. Currently, the vast majority of our presence is concentrated in Japan and Guam. There, we have fixed assets and fixed bases, which makes them more susceptible to attacks. Therefore, it is imperative that we expand our footprint in this region by establishing airfields and ports in the Philippines and Vietnam. Our plan calls for a smaller, more dispersed concentration of military assets. The move to expand our presence in the Philippines and Vietnam will be viewed as an aggressive act by China. So with that said, diplomacy with China is also very important. We will look to sustain a high level of strategic dialogue as an indispensable tool for setting limits, deterring challenges, dispelling misconceptions, building confidence, reducing risk through crisis prevention and management. To accomplish our goals, we will also work with International Peace and Sustainability Organization, also known as IPSO. This NGO's main focus is on peace and security, science, and technology sustainability development, and is headquartered in Japan. IPSO is an apolitical, independent in nature. It operates uniquely following rigorous scientific research for the sole purpose of building peace and sustainability in areas affected by social economic disparities. IPSO.com 2020. We will work with IPSO to invest $1 billion into the fiber networks of the Philippines and Vietnam. This investment project will greatly improve the status of communication infrastructure, particularly fiber network, while improving the broadband rates and speed to meet the needs of their citizens. Objective 1 of our plan calls for a collaborative partnering with the Department of the Navy and the Department of the Army. Once a plan of expansion is agreed upon with the Philippines and Vietnam, the Navy will be responsible for positioning personnel and equipment at the ports and waterways in the Southwest Asia region on a rotational basis. The Army will also deploy ballistic missile defense systems and the support personnel needed to support those assets on a rotational basis to this region. For the U.S. to achieve Objective 1, we would need to strengthen our relationships with the Philippines and with Vietnam. With both countries being a part of the UN, we will also work with the UN to ensure our actions are in accordance with international law and that they promote international cooperation.
Objective 2 of our plan is to relieve economic stress for those unstable countries. Objective 2 calls a more aggressive approach to counter China's actions as it relates to BRI. For this objective, we will employ the economic instrument of national power. It is well known that China used a tactic known as debt trap diplomacy to gain leverage over poor, developing countries impacted by the BRI. Jones 2020. If you are not familiar with the term debt trap diplomacy, it refers to China awarding loans to poor developing countries, and if and when they were unable to fulfill the commitments of those loans, then China could take over the assets, ideally gaining more control and more power within the region. Our plan would counter China's debt trap diplomacy tactic. Under our plan, the U.S. will establish its own lending policy to assist the economically weak countries renegotiate the terms of their China loans. This will help those countries avoid debt distress, lessening the likelihood that China could come in later and extract geopolitical concessions from them later. Baumick 2019. This will be a joint effort between the Treasury Department and the International Development Finance Corporation, also known as DFC. The DFC's lending capacity will be used to provide loans, loan guarantees, and insurance for development projects in lower income countries. The DFC has a lending capacity of $60 billion, which is more than double that of its predecessor. So funding will not be an issue as it relates to the renegotiation of these loans. In addition to working with the DFC, we will also work with the IGO, United Nations Development Project, also known as UNDP. According to their website, undp.org, they operate in over 170 countries and territories, helping to eradicate poverty, inequalities and exclusion, and build resilience so countries can sustain progress. As the UN's development agency, UNDP plays a critical role in helping countries achieve sustainable development goals. Since the vast majority of the countries we will be assisting to renegotiate their China loans are UN countries, we will lean heavily on the UNDP to ensure that the projects being developed are sustainable global projects that help to end poverty, protect the planet, and promote peace and prosperity for all people. The U.S. must keep pushing for transparency and fair competition for development projects impacted by BRI. Baumick 2019. Therefore, establishing a unified front with other major donor countries and regional allies is imperative. We must gather buy-in from Japan, Australia, India, the European Union, and New Zealand that China's lending practices are unsustainable and borderline unethical. Our success at swaying the opinions of our coalition partners could go a long way into finally shedding the light on China's true motives for the Belt and Road Initiative. The third and final objective of our operation is the building up of our military arsenal. Here, again, we will exercise the military instrument of national power by expanding our fleet of submarines, long-range bombers, F-35 aircraft, and ISR satellites. To accomplish this task, we will work with several NGOs, many of which we already have a successful working relationship with. The first NGO we will work with will be General Dynamics. General Dynamics will be contracted out to produce stealth submarines for our Navy counterparts. A strategic decision was made not to produce any aircraft carriers due to their size and exposure. They are very vulnerable to attacks from enemy. An additional NGO we will work with for Objective 3 is our long-standing relationship with Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. They will be contracted out to produce long-range bombers and additional F-35 aircraft. Increasing our bomber and fighter aircraft fleet enables the U.S. military to apply the mass principle of war concept. By applying the mass principle, the U.S. military is able to gain and maintain air superiority quicker and with less casualties. The last NGO we will look to provide support from will be SpaceX. The goal here will be for SpaceX to develop and deploy long-range ISR satellites into outer space. These satellites will monitor, collect, and send real-time information back to control centers managed by our Space Force counterparts. Having this capability affords us the opportunity to monitor and track China's actions in this region. To successfully accomplish Objective 3, it requires collaboration with all of our sister service departments. Each service department will be responsible for specifying the type and quantity of each asset needed to ensure that we are successful in building up our military force. Conversely, Space Force will be responsible for managing and maintaining the ISR satellite platforms once they become operational. I have just gave you a rundown of our 3 objectives. I've included which NGOs we will work with for each objective, which IGOs we will work with for each objective, and the role and responsibilities of our sister service and our coalition partners to ensure that we are successful in executing each one of these objectives. I will now turn the brief over to Derek, where he will go over in further detail our plan of execution.
Good morning. Now that David gave us a great introduction to what the colossal Belt and Road Project is and what China is trying to do, we have a little bit better understanding of why it's important. Since Mike already covered some of the core mission support aspects of our initiative, and since Jack just went over some of the key joint interagency, intergovernmental partnerships that we plan on leveraging and developing for our plan, I'm now going to move straight into the 3-phased approach of how we will execute our plan in more detail. For our first strategic initiative, it's going to be expanding the U.S. presence in Asia and Europe. Part of our 2018 National Defense Strategy, line of effort number 2, specifically talks about strengthening our alliances and attracting new partnerships around the world. To be able to initially do this, we are planning on increasing foreign military sales to some of our partners. Currently, we only have a certain amount of countries that we do sell to, but in order to expand the United States' influence and to be able to have more interoperability, we need to start doing this on a more global scale. Something that we're going to focus on under that military sales is more interoperability between countries. If we can have a more routine approach towards selling these same types of radios, for example, Harris radios that the United States uses or our Five Eye partners use to these other countries, we will have a much better interoperable joint force, and we will be able to close some of these gaps we've had in the past. The second thing is focusing on modernization or modernizing our equipment, technology, and networks abroad. Some of the air defense systems, some of the aircraft, some of the other things we have currently overseas are aging and are not the latest and greatest equipment that we need, especially when we're talking about a near-peer competitor. The third sub-bullet will be selling and providing training on specifically aircraft sensors, new sonar systems for the Navy and maritime assets, and then updated radar and air defense systems, both for the host country and the overseas US base that are operating them. It is imperative that we have a joint fighting picture with these countries and that we are on the same systems for us to be effective. Second initiative under expanding our US presence, specifically in Europe, will be to fortify and further solidify our North Atlantic Treaty, or NATO, our alliance and commitment there. To do this, we're adding an additional 5,000 troops moving to specific US bases in Poland, Italy, and Bulgaria. Additionally, our program will pledge an additional $25 million in upgrading NATO-specific aircraft and armored vehicles. Because of the last 20 years that we've had contingencies in the Middle East, a lot of this equipment has become outdated, and since one specific country didn't roger up the money, a lot of this equipment that NATO uses is becoming outdated. In order to do this, we need to continue to promote a strong and free Europe bound by our shared principles of democracy and national sovereignty. This is specifically targeted towards countering what large countries are doing to either become a puppet government or bully smaller governments. Examples of this are the possible takeover in key strategic areas in Ukraine that Russia has done in the past, or like Taiwan, where they are desperately trying to be independent from China and asking the United States for assistance on gaining independence, but have been met with severe resistance from mainland China. Lastly, we will have to attract new partnerships by capitalizing on opportunities that are both beneficial to the host country and the United States. We have to ensure that we are providing attractive and unique solutions to these countries and helping meet and solve problems that they have had historically that only the United States will be able to help solve. Additionally, something that we will focus on is conducting more large-scale military exercises overseas with our joint partners. The Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, Matthew Donovan, stated, "We've grown accustomed to a rotational mindset, really since the end of Desert Storm, where we rotate small units in on mature infrastructure with a focus on countering violent extremist organization. It's something that we have to shift away from. We need to focus on being agile, effective, and interoperable." He's specifically discussing about moving away from some of the smaller exercises that are violent extremist organization focused and moving on to larger exercises that focus on our ability to deal with near peer adversaries. Something else through these exercises that we can work on is closing the gap on our joint operations or our multi-domains, specifically connecting the dots from air, ground, sea, and space, and integrating all those domains into one joint force. This would be ensuring that not only the United States can connect these dots, but that our partners that would possibly be supporting us or the campaign that we're in can do so as well. We will also look at establishing a more joint military naval presence in Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, Egypt, and Kenya, with targeted areas of counter-piracy, counter-drug operations, and VBSS, or Vessel Boarding Search and Seizure. These key countries are along very strategic waterways that we have to ensure remain open and that we have freedom of navigation through these passages. Areas like the Straits of Malacca at Indonesia, the Suez Canal in Egypt, or the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. These are all key terrain that the Chinese have looked at controlling, specifically in the South China Sea, but more importantly, establishing ports at these key areas to ensure that they have control over the shipping and the trade through these routes. The reason this plan is feasible is because the U.S. military already currently conducts over 80 military exercises or joint exercises with foreign militaries annually across the globe. We also have over 500 bases abroad, excluding Antarctica currently, and have kept a constant forward presence since the early 19th century. What's important is that we need to continue to bolster our relationships and partnerships, because if we leave or do not have this presence, other countries were going to move in and exploit these countries like China is currently doing, specifically in parts of Asia and Africa. Some risks associated with the plan are the funding of it and our defense budget. Also, other risks are changes in foreign leaders and their policy about how they feel about the United States, but we will counter these risks by being our trusted partner, following through with our promises, and ensuring we continue to earmark money and foreign aid dedicated to our partners. Our second line of effort will be reciprocal response, countering unfair trade practices. That's line of effort number 4 from the U.S. National Security, drafted in 2018. China's predatory lending practices have little to no oversight, are often one-sided, and have left many vulnerable countries unable to repay their debts to China, forcing them to surrender key resources, valuable real estate. Some examples, like my colleagues have talked about, were in the country of Sri Lanka, losing their port for 99 years. But there's also countries in South America that most people don't know, like Ecuador, that have now lost most of their oil rights, their mineral rights, and even the Galapagos Islands to the Chinese that are currently holding them in debt. In Djibouti, they financed and built Africa's largest port and control most of the internet and railways that run from Djibouti underwater to Yemen, controlling all of the information flow. So with the Chinese doing all of this to all these vulnerable countries around the world, the way that the United States is going to respond or reciprocally respond is through their U.S. Development of Finance Corporation, also known as the DFC. The DFC was established in 2019 through the passage of the Build or Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development Act, which strengthened and modernized American developmental finance. The BUILD Act combined the capabilities of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, and the Developmental Credit Authority, which had previously been housed in the U.S. Agency for International Development, or better known as USAID. So how will we be different, or our loans be different than the Chinese loans? Well, first of all, our loans and investments will adhere to high standards and respect the environment, human rights, and workers' rights, unlike many of the very loose loans that the Chinese originate from their state banks. Secondly, we will focus on funding our ethical investments across multiple sectors, including energy, healthcare, critical infrastructure, and new emerging technology. Our roadmap for impact is over a 5-year strategy that aims to catalyze and invest up to $100 billion to maximize development and impacting while creating strategic and sustainable growth in these European and Southeast Asian markets that desperately need the money. To ensure the U.S. taxpayer dollars all have a home to go to, we have a very targeted 4-prong approach to how we are going to use and structure these loans. Initially, it will focus on debt financing. We will finance new loans and help pay off existing loans that countries have to the Chinese with guarantees up to $1 billion for tenors as long as 25 years to help pay off their loans. Secondly, we will focus on education. Stand up local education programs in some of these countries that teach economic viable forms of private sector lending and investment. We will help educate decision makers on the differences of ethical private sector alternatives versus the Chinese state-directed banks, which often leave countries with less resources and saddle with debt once they realize they cannot repay China. But it's not all about the money. We also have to ensure we are funding job growth. Our target goal of investing in infrastructure projects that will support the creation of up to 500,000 jobs, not just jobs, local jobs, and work to protect workers' rights in these developing Asian countries. For some of the countries that can't afford loans, we will have foreign aid programs. They will focus on the lowest countries' GDPs or the bottom 10 percentile, and we will seek grants and U.S. government aid programs with zero repayment costs. Lastly, if China does not heed warnings and still continues their unethical trade and loan practices that bully smaller, vulnerable nations, then the United States will address other allied countries in joining them by putting up in place a 50% tariff on all Chinese imports, ultimately crippling their manufacturing, export-heavy economy. The reason we feel that this plan is feasible is because the DFC is already an established and a credible lending organization that has a successful track record of granting over $5 billion in loans in foreign programs and infrastructure development since their inception in 2019. They are already in operation and are a credible institution globally recognized in more than 36 countries. The main risk to this plan is China throwing more money and dirty loans and trying to lend greater sums with no standards. We will counter this risk by exposing their unethical morals, their zero disregard for human rights, and show historically what they have done to other countries that have accepted and defaulted on their loans. Some of the risks associated with this plan are the inability to repay back the U.S. loans, or countries that may have losses due to currency inconvertibility, government interference, and political violence, to include terrorism. We will reduce these risks by having separate private organizations that will issue political risk insurance for these loans. Their insurance will cover up to $1 billion against losses due to currency inconvertibility, government interference, and political violence, to include terrorism. The third and final strategic objective that we will execute will be the buildup of space networks and the use of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This is in line with Pillar 3 and 4 of the U.S. National Security Strategy, which is preserve peace through strength, advancement of American influence. Currently, the China National Space Agency is arguably the fastest rising space agency in the world. Concurrent with China's economic miracle, the Chinese space program has grown considerably over the past 2 decades and has been mounting increasingly advanced and ambitious missions. This is according to Mr. John Williams, a NASA engineer, as of 2019. The United States, and specifically the NASA and U.S. Space Force, will continue to partner and pursue joint strategic objectives in space with the European Space Agency, the Indian Space Research Organization, and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. These are some of our closest and trusted allies that have been working on us to achieve dominance in space for the last 30 to 40 years. Some of the specific things we will be working on with them are developing a joint military satellite network shared between India, Japan, and certain European NATO nations to share and pass information. We will also ultimately be looking at attaining a 5-year goal on having armed satellites that are capable of self-protecting and the ability to add munitions to them should the need arise. We will also conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance training and education through shared satellite images, unmanned aircraft pilot programs, and educational training teams that focus on the imagery and signals intelligence in key countries around Asia and Europe. We will also be offering up to $500 million in tax incentives for US-based companies like SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing, and helping key countries develop initial baseline capabilities in lower income nations directly associated with their space programs. The Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Manpower, Mr. Matthew Donovan, has said The linchpin to this digital modernization is to seamlessly connect all of our data in space in real time. Because of some of our foundational analog practices, we are at risk of falling behind our competitors. I think he realizes how important the future of space warfare is and how important it is to be dominant in space. To move forward in this objective, our last large initiative will be partnering with SpaceX in their large joint venture called Starlink, which is satellite communication or a large satellite communication network program that has extreme accessibility and world coverage of broadband internet. The Starlink satellite communication network specializes in connecting joint domains through low orbit satellites. Specifically, this new system can provide connectivity to run systems online and interconnected through broadband internet at much more reliable rates and at cheaper services. The plan is to deploy 12,000 satellites with an extension or a possible later extension of up to 42,000 that would be able to push 150 megabits per second internet above the range that currently exists for this type of technology. Since several of the lower income countries throughout Southeast Asia don't have the infrastructure yet to support landlines and fiber level internet, the Starlink system will prove to be an extremely viable and valuable technology to these countries. It will help them begin to emerge as a second and first world country, to get plugged into new technologies and to be able to utilize the internet like it's never been utilized before. We feel that this plan is feasible because we already have established space programs jointly with India and Japan, two of the world's leading space-capable countries. We also feel the plan is feasible because the majority of the infrastructure we will use is already in space and has positive beta testing in North America and in Canada as early as 2020. This technology is expected to roll out in most parts of the world by the end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022. And the technology is only continuing to get better with the internet speeds being faster. Some of the risks associated with this plan are setbacks within the commercial sector of satellites not working well or there being major delays to their rollouts. Other risks are Chinese infiltration or manipulation of our planned linked networks in space that will help bring some of these countries online. Ways we are mitigating these risks are by allowing certain countries access to not just the SpaceX satellites, but to our military satellites that we currently have in orbit. We will also eventually have armed satellites, as I spoke about in our 5-year plan with India and Japan, capable of self-protection, but also other countries' satellite destruction. And as Jack said, we are also going to mitigate risks by investing heavily in our own infrastructure with counter-defense technologies and to develop certain tactics, techniques, and procedures through our newly developed Space Force branch that will exploit weaknesses in the Chinese network and systems attempting to infiltrate not just our cyber network, but our space networks.
That was a lot of great information. And to conclude, I will now summarize the main points. China's BRI has placed them at the center of trade and commerce in Asia and Europe. Their use of government and military to take over key land and sea routes has been troubling for the United States. We examined existing doctrine and came up with 3 objectives. Expand our presence in Southeast Asia, relieve economic stress of unstable governments, and build up space power. Next, Mike talked about utilizing cyber ISR to leverage our plans to counter BRI. He highlighted the importance of persistent training in multi-domain exercises and its impact on international relationships. Next, Jack talked about instruments of national power and how we can utilize diplomacy, military, and economic actions to counter BRI. He also demonstrated the importance of working with NGOs and IGOs, such as the International Peace and Sustainability Office, the International Development Finance Corporation, and SpaceX, and described how they would be integrated into our plan. Finally, he talked about engaging joint and coalition partners to be long-term members of our strategic plans. Derek wrapped everything together with our execution plan. He detailed how we will expand our presence in Southeast Asia through the use of joint exercises and operations, how we will employ reciprocal response strategy to counter unfair trade practices and corruption, and finally, how we will build up space power by expanding our space networks and partnering with agencies such as NASA, SpaceX, and the Space Force. I hope that you now know more about China's Belt and Road Initiative. There is a plethora of information out there. These are some of the resources that we used that I encourage you to read on your own. Pending any questions, this concludes our brief.